Okay, thank you, everybody. Welcome to our today's National Entrepreneurship Week event. I'm so happy to be joining with some familiar faces here with our good friends at VentureWell, who are going to be moderating an amazing panel discussion today. So I'm going to pass it over to Shaheen and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Annalisa, and wonderful to see folks joining. So I'm Shaheen Mamawala, calling in, as I said, from the Gulf Coast of Florida, and I'm Director of Planning and Partnerships at VentureWell. I'm going to start with just a few quick slides to give some background and introduction, but most of our time together will be discussion with our presenters and hopefully lots and lots of time for Q&A. So I'm going to start. Just a little bit of background. All right, so I'm joined today by Zoe Hunter, Jason Green, and Monica Dean, and in a little while they'll introduce themselves, where they're calling in from, and a little bit of background about the resources that they'll be presenting today. But first, I just wanted to start with a little bit of introduction and background. So VentureWell is a nonprofit US-based organization. We're about 27 years old. And we cultivate science and technology innovators who are working on innovations and ventures to solve complex challenges and create lasting impact. And this event is part of a much larger body of work that we've committed to as an organization and been working on for a number of years around equity and inclusion. One of the keystones of that work was a report that we published in 2020 that was informed by a study which talked to a number of student innovators, entrepreneurship center directors, and faculty members. And the focus of that study was really to bring forward promising practices and existing efforts for advancing equity within higher education, and particularly with the lenses of science and technology and innovation and entrepreneurship. And really what that report focused on, and what I'll share on the next slide, is a framework or blueprint of 6 interrelated action areas and strategies that programs and universities, as well as really in other contexts, can start to use and think about in making their programming more inclusive and engaging. And then I also wanted to note that the focus of the study and the report, and really central to the way VentureWell is thinking about this work, is around amplifying the voices and access of groups within science and technology innovation who are underrepresented, and in particular named some of those identity markers here. So another quick word on the action areas, and we'll also put in the chat a link to the full report because I'll go through this pretty quickly. So there were these sort of 6 areas of focus, and each of them is coupled with a guiding question. And as I said, the study really focused on the voices and experiences of students. And so those questions and themes are really represented here. And just a quick note that action area 6 is the one that really focuses on the organizational level. The others are really more focused at the venture or center level. So as we go through, you may hear references to these action areas. And again, encourage you to take a look at the full report that we'll link to in the chat. So just by way of context for sort of the road that we've traveled up into this conversation. So after we released our report in 2020, we had a series of community conversations where we were able to dig into the action areas more deeply, so 2 at a time. And then coming out of that, we're able to partner with the presenters that you'll hear from today on 3 different resources that really took the action areas and really applied them to the contexts that they were in within their campuses and communities. And we just finished a series of 3 additional conversations that deep dived into each of those. So today is actually a sort of compilation and roll up of our last 3 meetings, and allows you to hear from each of those presenters and understand a bit more about each of those resources. So before we jump into discussion with the presenters, we wanted to do just a quick poll to see who's in the room today. And so that should be popped up on your screen. If you can take a moment to share the items that best identify you. It's always helpful for us to see who's in the room. give you just a couple more seconds to finish. It looks like most people have been able to apply. All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and close the poll and pop that back up. Excellent. So it looks like we have folks from a number of different sectors. And that's really helpful for us to know as we jump in. Perfect. So just a quick note, and people are already using the chat, so please continue to use that for introductions, questions. So how we'll proceed from here is starting with a couple questions for each presenter, both for them to introduce themselves and the context that they're working in, as well as to talk a little bit about the resource that they worked on. And then we'll transition to Q&A for the remainder of the conversation. So again, just to give an overview of our three featured speakers. So first, we're going to speak with Zoe Hunter, who's the Managing Director of the NACCE Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, and focused on the resource transforming programs through an equity lens. Then we'll hear from Jason Green, Assistant Director, Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative at Portland State University, and the resource Embracing Catalytic Events for Change. And finally, Monica Dean, Managing Director, the Lloyd Greif Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, the Marshall School of Business at USC, and the resource Mapping Inclusive Pathways to Entrepreneurship. So as you can see, that's a lot to cover. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing so that we can start to jump in. All right, so we're gonna actually start first with Zoe, and just a quick word about the resource Transforming Programs Through an Equity Lens. So that resource was focused on 2 assessment tools that were designed to facilitate deep and thoughtful conversations among staff about how to integrate DEI practices and learnings into programmatic work. So Zoe, could you start by introducing yourself, your role, and perhaps just a brief little bit of context and background on that resource?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Shaheen. So excited to be here. So I am Zoe Hunter, Managing Director at SciCity for short. I have been in my Managing Director role for almost a year now, but I started working with SciCity as an Innovation Fellow about 2 years ago, and kind of graduated up through the ranks. In my role, I'm responsible for collaboratively overseeing our programming. We have tons of programming and resources for our students. So I share that oversight role with my co-MD. She's also amazing. And then I'm also responsible for overseeing our communication strategy as well as our DE&I strategy, which is really what brings me here today. Really briefly, so SciCity's mission is to inspire students from diverse backgrounds and disciplines to seek innovative ways to solve real world problems. And with that, diversity, as you can see, is core to our mission, is core to our functioning. And so when we introduced our particular programming tool, which I'll talk more about in a moment, it was critical because it's in our mission and it's core to exactly what we do. So that's just a brief overview.
Great, thanks so much. So yeah, let's get into the framework. And I will say as well, you know, from VentureWell's perspective, when we first began to collaborate with SciCity and learn about that framework, we were really excited because I think it was at a time where we were also just starting to figure out ways that we wanted to start looking internally at our own programs. And so it was really exciting to hear about. So it is called the SURGE framework. So maybe if you can describe a little bit about first, I guess, what that acronym stands for, and then talk a little bit about how it works and how you implement it in your programs.
Absolutely. So SURGE was introduced by my predecessor in 2018 after many, many conversations about, okay, diversity is core to what we do, but how do we actually operationalize that, right? Like, how do we make sure that it's embedded in all that we're doing at our center? And so based on some previous work from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, he created this SURGE framework. And SURGE stands for Social Equity, Racial Justice. And it's a framework we use when we're program planning. So all of our program owners are asked a series of questions that serve as important considerations when creating their programs, right? Questions like, who is typically underrepresented in the field that this program addresses? Is your lineup of speakers, judges, application reviewers, et cetera, diverse? Are there logistical logistical requirements that might restrict or prohibit folks from participating, right? And so asking that line of questions as our program owners are planning is so important, because it starts to center and make sure that we're centering equity and inclusion and diversity, and really building it into the program as the program is being built, and not as an afterthought, which is super important. It rolled out in various phases, honestly. And so the first phase, of course, after all the questions were created and we were ready to move forward with it, was it served as kind of like a checklist for program owners. So what would happen is that program owners would plan their program, and along with the other programming workflow that they had, they would look at the questions on this checklist and answer them to themselves, and make sure that they're taking into the consideration all of the things reflected in the framework. The challenge with that, though, was that it seemed very overwhelming for program owners, because the checklist was so long and there were so many things to consider. And there was also just a very little accountability there, right? You're setting people to tackle these questions, some of which may not understand the full context of the work or why it's necessarily important to the work. And so they relied only on their own understanding of it. And there were no checks and balances. We couldn't go to them and say, okay, well, what are the answers to all these questions? Because it wasn't framed like that, right? And so from that, we moved on to phase two. And phase two was that the program owner and a member of our DE&I working group would have a collaborative conversation answering the questions. And this created a lot of space for the program owners to collectively think through the answers to the questions, and also allowed a member from our working group to offer recommendations and suggestions, or also offer some insight that the program owner may not have considered, right? And that served to be an extremely helpful process for the program owner. But in doing that, we realized that there was a lot of overlap between program design and program outreach, right? So if a program owner identified that, let's say, women are underrepresented in the field that their program is addressing, then it would be, from the communications perspective, an intentional strategy needed to be created for us to reach more women, to make sure that we're inviting women into the space, since they are traditionally underrepresented. And so in phase three, we shifted from that conversation being with the program owner and the working group member to the conversation being with the program owner and our communications director. And the communications director happened to be part of the working group, but she was approaching the meeting from two lenses, right? From her work on the DE&I working group and her work as a marketing and communications professional. And so the SCRJ framework now, as it's used, is part program design. So asking those very important questions about, is the way the program designed inclusive, equitable, and creating space for diversity? And then a second set of questions for outreach. If based on the answers that were provided in program design section, how are we now being strategic to make sure that we're intentionally inviting the people who have not been traditionally invited to this space to this space?
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I love the way you described the multiple phases, as well as the different perspectives. And I think that's really resonant, both in terms of, the things that we've reflected on at VentureWell, but also in thinking about just sort of really living into Action Area 6, right? So sort of thinking about the holistic embracing of equity and inclusion. And part of that is thinking about all those skill sets that come together to really create that opportunity. So we're actually going to pivot next to Jason. I know that I just want to name that each of these resources are really different from each other. And so we wanted to make sure that up front, we really give you an opportunity to hear a bit about each and then have an open dialogue, because I think you'll start to see how things weave together. So thanks so much, Zoe, for that initial introduction on Surge. And so now I wanted to invite Jason Green to speak a little bit about the research that he worked on, which was called Embracing Catalytic Events for Change, and a little bit of context on that resource. So this resource focused on 3 personal narratives that were centered on catalytic events that propelled each author into deeper, more authentic personal and professional engagement around DEI. So we had 3 stories that were shared. Jeff Smith, who reflected on an experience following the murder of George Floyd, Juan Barraza focused his story on separating families at the US-Mexican border and the impact that that had on him. And then Jason and the Catalytic event for him was the murder of Michael Brown. So would love to hear first, Jason, if you can just introduce yourself, your role, and a little bit of context and background about the resource.
Yeah, thank you, Shaheen. So I'm Jason Green. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the assistant director and one of the co-founders of the Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative, which is a research center at Portland State University. And before that, I was the director of Impact Entrepreneurs, which is a set of social entrepreneurship and social innovation programs out of the School of Business here. So Zoe and Monica have some just incredible tools and resources that I'd really encourage you all to look at. I'm going to be talking about something a little bit differently, which is sort of my identity and positionality as a white man, and these moments that made me think differently about the world and my place in it, which I hope are useful for other white people who are thinking about this and are sort of, you know, at any stage of their own journey here. So I hope it can be useful to you as well. For me, it was really the murder of Michael Brown and the protests in Ferguson that made me begin to see things differently. I, in response to that, started doing a lot of research around police violence against people of color. You know, and this is something that hadn't really been showing up in the news a lot before. And because of my own privilege, I hadn't really seen or experienced or had to think about. And, you know, as somebody who is, you know, I run a research center now. I do research. And so I connect with the data. And the data tell a really clear story. And it's one of systemic racism. You know, it's very obvious when you start to dig into it. It's not just a bad apple here or a bad apple there or a mistake. It is something that is a fundamental issue across our society. And that, for me, you know, that's really the only conclusion that you can draw from the research and the data. And that began to reshape the way I thought about the world around me. Because if there is systemic racism in policing, it's obviously not limited just to policing. It must be endemic to every system and institution that we take part in: business, academia, nonprofits, you know, probably my family, my community, and myself, right? It is a challenge to sort of rethink the way in which we, or I rather, as a white man, engage with the world and see the world. And so, you know, I was engaging with it up here. I was looking at the research, looking at the data, and it was revealing these things I'd never really dug into or thought about before, which was in itself upsetting because I had this huge blind spot. But I also started watching the videos of these murders and letting myself feel some of that grief and that rage at what I was seeing. It was, you know, they are incredibly, incredibly disturbing. And what you see in the video is very clear and is often very, very different from what you read in police reports or the news. And that's also pretty upsetting, and again, points to the systemic issues at play here. And it was that emotional connection, I think, that really, really spurred me to action. And I began to rethink everything about the programs I ran, the courses I taught, how I engage with my community. And, you know, for me, it's a lifelong journey. I'm going to be working on this forever. It's not something where I go to a training and I think I'm done. It's a lifelong journey, but it gave me a sense that we have to act now. We have to act quickly. There's no time to wait. And the impacts are huge. And obviously I, as a white man, have a role in this as well, in dismantling racism. Because if I'm not dismantling racism, by ignoring it, I am, perpetuating these systems. So I began looking at everything we did in our courses, how I taught, how we engaged with people, the materials we used. I pulled together a lot of different resources, the trainings and readings. And essentially what I did was a lot of what Zoe and Monica are talking about here, and these incredible resources that I wish had been around. But is really that, allowing myself to feel this grief and engage on that personal level that I think was an incredibly powerful motivating factor. And there was one other event that I talk about in this article, and that was the murder of a Black man, Jason Washington, by campus police, right around the corner from my office. Well, he was trying to break up a bar fight. And that had a profound impact on me and the entire campus community. It was and is incredibly heartbreaking. And years later, we are still dealing with the emotional impact of that and the fallout of that. And again, you look into the research, you look at the studies, you watch the videos, and these things are all connected. And I think we as administrators, as faculty, as entrepreneurs, especially if you're white, you have a really important role to play in dismantling these systems, in doing the right thing, in making change. And I think it's important for us to engage with it, not just on an intellectual level, with the tools and resources. It is essentially do that, but it's also important, I think, to think about that internal work in whatever way you're going to engage with it, and think about your own privilege, identities, your positionality, your perspectives on the world. For me, it's been an imperfect journey. It's an ongoing one, but I would invite all of you to think about how you are moving along that journey and what can help you in that as well.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. And I wonder, before we transition to Monica's presentation, is you mentioned the resonance within the campus community of the situation that you described that happened in Portland State. And I wonder, as you have gone along your journey, are there ways in which you've engaged with your peers, your colleagues, and your campus community differently? And if there's anything you want to add about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just showing up is important, showing up in spaces that are not led by other white men. Allowing myself to grieve in community has been really hard. Culturally for me, that's been something I was taught to never do. So not show grief and sadness growing up. So it's been hard, but it's also been really helpful to be in those spaces and to be able to grieve collectively with people. And also just making certain that I did a better job of listening. I realized that I don't have to have the answers, and I'm not going to find the answers on my own. All I can do is listen to folks who, because of their identity experience, are closer to these issues than I am, really listen to them, and then work with them to implement the solutions that they're seeking.
Thank you for sharing that. So I want to now give an opportunity to Monica Dean to share our third resource, Mapping Inclusive Pathways to Entrepreneurship. And the little context introduction for that I'll share is this resource is a creative illustration of multiple pathways to success in entrepreneurship to represent and support student innovators from a broader range of backgrounds, interests, and lived experiences. And in a moment, we'll share that visual. First, I want to give Monica a chance to introduce herself, your role in your organization, and any other context or background you want to share.
Great, thank you. So I think it's afternoon for everybody there. It's morning for me. So I'm Monica Dean, and I have almost 2 decades of experience leading entrepreneurship centers. Currently, I am at USC leading the Greif Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, where I oversee the development and execution of all co-curricular programs focused on a founder pipeline, spanning from opportunity recognition through succession and exit. I was previously the inaugural director of the Jill Kerr Conway Innovation Entrepreneurship Center at Smith College. And prior to that, I was the director of the Lawrence and Field Programs in Entrepreneurship at Baruch College, City University of New York. I am currently a board member of Venture Well and the Global Consortium for Entrepreneurship Centers. I'm an angel investor and an investment committee member of the Mass Mutual Catalyst Fund. So my perspective on multiple pathways stems from my experience in supporting and developing student entrepreneurs at 3 very different institutions, which I just mentioned: a public institution with a majority minority population, a small women's liberal arts college, and a large private institution. These students that I have interacted with come from diverse ethnic and economic backgrounds, with diverse access to resources. They come to college or university having grown up in a family business, or they grew up in a thriving entrepreneurship ecosystem and have startup fever, or they are just by nature curious, creative, and love solving problems, or they are committed to improving their communities or to social justice issues. But at their core, all of these students are trying to solve a problem, and I believe that there are different pathways that can address their needs. So the Inclusive Pathways resource was developed during COVID when one of my best friends and her daughter came to live with me since she had to leave her campus housing. We've both spent the majority of our careers in academia, but in very different areas. My background is in engineering, business, and entrepreneurship. And my colleague, Cheryl Finley, who I co-created this resource with, is currently the director of the Atlanta University Center for Art and Curatorial Studies Collective and a distinguished visiting professor of art history at Spelman College. So during our time together, we became thought partners, sharing and running ideas by each other about our respective work. And what became apparent is that we were both working with students who were interested in solving problems who came from different backgrounds. And these discussions we were having were also happening around the time of the murder of George Floyd and protests in support of Black Lives Matter and a heightened awareness around social justice. This was also around the time that VentureWell published its Advancing Equity report, which I had shared with Cheryl, and many of the findings confirmed what I had experienced at Smith College, again, which is a small liberal arts women's college in Western Mass. And when I was at Smith, I was tasked with trying to grow a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship at an institution whose students did not choose to even come to the college because of their interest in entrepreneurship. And my experience there spurred the idea of these inclusive pathways, which are different than what I see currently at USC, where students come here either majoring in business or entrepreneurship. So when Cheryl and I were contemplating the variety of inclusive pathways, we settled on mapping when thinking about how current technologies such as GIS, which often reveal multiple pathways, could be used as a resource tool. But we wanted something that was visually appealing, and the thought of using a map which reveals different routes and the steps or directions one takes along a route would be attractive to not only educators, but students, while offering different approaches to launching successful ventures. So the first pathway that we have, so Shaheen, if you want to show the pathways, yeah, great. So everybody can see that. Okay, great. So the first pathway introduces the student who is interested in social issues plaguing his community. And in this specific case, it's homelessness. So the student learns about the school's entrepreneurship center through a presentation at an affinity club. This brings the student decides to check out an entrepreneurship center open house where the student meets like-minded students and begins to strategize on possible solutions. Now hooked on getting a better handle on entrepreneurship studies, the student attends an inclusive innovation workshop and seeks out a design thinking course. Equipped to apply with what the student has learned about inclusive thinking and problem-solving strategies, the student lands an experiential opportunity such as a field study or an internship, and then tests a solution developed around the problem of homelessness in the student's community. After graduation, the student then implements this solution, solving a complex problem in their community, and uses other tools of social entrepreneurship. So a second pathway is a first-gen student who has also been a self-motivated problem solver. And this student is introduced to the school's entrepreneurship center at a student club fair and becomes intrigued by the center's offerings by a fellow first-gen student representative. The student then decides to take an entrepreneurship course and learns again more about innovative problem solving. Taking this immersion into entrepreneurship up a notch, the student attends an inclusive innovation workshop and enrolls in a design thinking course. The student then talks to their professor and winds up landing a paid summer internship and applies what they have learned. And all this experience leads to the student upon graduation accepting a job where the student feels empowered to apply the knowledge learned and joins a team that uses inclusive entrepreneurial mindset in developing creative solutions to complex problems. And the last pathway refers to a student who has a family member with a disability, and their experience with this sparks the idea of developing either a tech or tech-enabled product or service. And they decide that they would like to pursue it further and take an introduction to entrepreneurship course and maybe others. In this course, they learn about the importance of having a diverse team, invite two friends, one who's an engineering major, one who's a business major, and they're all passionate about entrepreneurship and decide to use this invention that they created or apply for or into an entrepreneurship competition on campus. They win the competition, they get money, and then they go back to get advice from the Entrepreneurship Center on campus to learn how they should move forward. And they are told that they should do some more customer validation. They apply to an accelerator program, and subsequently they develop a working prototype and they wind up launching their venture. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Monica. So I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. I know we have covered a lot in the first half of our time together. And I just wanted to say a couple things just from Ventural's perspective. So one, just gratitude to all of these presenters as well as their co-collaborators on this resource. I think when we initially put our report and action framework, we were really hopeful that there would be moments where we got to sort of these applied interpretations of the framework. And so it's just really exciting to see those brought to life. Certainly these resources, and I think the presenters have all really referenced this, sort of are interconnected, and there's so much opportunity just across the ecosystem and the many dimensions of innovation and venture pathways. So wanted to pause and invite those of you who have been tuning in and listening to share any questions that you have. So let's check and see if there's anything in the chat. And thank you for those of you who've had the opportunity to introduce yourselves, and please keep that coming as well.
Yeah, Shaheen, I don't see any questions coming in just yet. I think everyone's absorbing all the amazing introductions and knowledge and resources that you have all shared. I think it's quite a bit, but I'm sure more will come through very shortly.
Great. Okay. So we'll give you a second to think. Maybe I'll start with, oh, actually, perfect. I see a question from Mike. Okay. Yep. So Mike was asking, Mike's question is for Zoe to talk a little bit more about implementation. And I wonder, building on that question, if you can also talk about, for anyone who may be in the audience who's thinking about implementation of a similar framework, what advice would you give them and how might they get started?
Yeah, great question, Shaheen. Thank you. So in terms of actually implementing a framework that's similar or any framework really that you're trying to introduce to your organization, I think buy-in is really, really important. As mentioned earlier, diversity, equity, and inclusion is very core to our mission. So luckily we had buy-in from the very beginning. And it was easy to kind of start brainstorming collaboratively on possible solutions. But with buy-in, I would also encourage, to the extent that you can, include all the stakeholders in the conversation, right? If you have other members of your team who the framework or the process or the policy will impact, it's so important to bring them to the table in those early conversations so that you're not just creating this solution, giving it to them only to find out that it's not a solution at all, but that it makes their work more complicated or more difficult. Really include people in the conversation early on. I think that's super important and helpful. The other thing is, of course, don't be afraid to iterate. As I shared, like our implementation happened in phases. And so when we realized the first phase didn't work, we were able to pivot and find an alternative. So don't be afraid to that. And lastly, I would say, understand and recognize that, especially in DE&I work, this is just a piece to a larger puzzle. This SCRJ framework that we use is only one part of our overall DE&I strategy. It is not it in its totality. And so it's really important to recognize that and to say, okay, we did this thing, or we're doing this thing. Now, what else can we do to make sure that we're creating a very, very holistic DE&I approach?
I love that. And I think the journey is something that's a theme that I'm hearing from across all of you. And Monica, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
I have a question for Zoe. So I came, I've only been at USC for a little bit over a year, but my question is, I came in you're preaching to the choir to me, right? I'm all in, but the issue for me has been coming into an organization that's used to doing things the same way, right? And coming into a situation where I would say, overwhelmingly, those who were bought in as guest speakers or whatever, people that we're focusing on, look a certain way. And it's been a challenge to for me, whenever I'm working on new programming, this is what I'm talking about. But again, if nobody else looks like me, and there's only maybe, a handful of people who think the way that I think, it's a challenge, right? Because others who are here want, to maintain the status quo. So I guess my question is, have you had to deal with those challenges?
That's a great question. We have had the privilege of not having to butt heads too much during the process of us implementing some of these processes. And I say that's a privilege because I know that's not everyone's experience, right? I know there are so many organizations and people doing this work that, to your point, Monica, are the only ones in the room, or the only ones willing to advocate and go to bat for things like this. So I can't say that within my center or organization we've had that problem. I will say, however, in my past work at Yale is a very traditional institution. They're very kind of, this is how we've done it. Let's keep continuing to do it that way. It has been challenging. One of the things that has helped, and it's unfortunate, I guess, in this society that we still have to kind of do this, but really getting people to understand the importance of diversity, right? Demographic diversity, diversity of discipline, diversity of thought even, and really helping them to recognize how it does impact positively the work that we're doing, or the work that you're doing. And it can be frustrating when you spend a lot of time doing that and laying that groundwork, but it is also very, very impactful. I think the other thing that has helped is at least finding one ally or advocate that can stand beside you, who may not look like you or who may have more power than you, to stand with you and advocate for some of the things you're hoping to do. Can also make a good impact. It is very difficult work though. As you know, it's extremely difficult and it takes a lot of fortitude and perseverance. But I mean, in my experience, that's usually what has helped when there has been kind of that dissension or that strong disagreement towards moving forward in that way.
Right. Now, I mean, and leadership is committed and is an ally, but there are other people that used to doing things a certain way.
And we,
So
and we
thank-
all know that not everyone is okay with change, right?
And I see a comment in the chat from Katie that says getting folks to embrace a shared vision is challenging. However, if you can get them to focus on the larger definition of diversity that Zoe is talking about, it often makes it real for white people. So yeah, I think that toggling between the specific and that sort of shared value set around maybe a program outcome as well as the bigger picture is one of those tensions for sure. There's a few other questions in the chat, so I want to go scroll back up here. So Paul, this is a question for Monica. How do your programs at USC work with immigrants and refugees who come from an entrepreneurial family or ecosystem?
So as of, so again, I've only been here a year. So, my focus over the past year has been internal on programming that's delivered solely to students at USC, and that dealing with entrepreneurs from the for the surrounding community is definitely on the agenda. Again, I've had to focus internally, and one of the things that Zoe said that resonated with me was that, again, we're not seeing diversity in the students who come to programming. So I literally had to go through, we have like 1,100 clubs at USC, and I had to look through the constitutions for all of these clubs, looking for those that were affinity related, and then send personal invites to the presidents of those clubs and work with the person who's the head of DE&I at the business school to intentionally reach out and invite them to our programming, because they did not feel that, they didn't feel like they were part of the conversation or should be, they did not feel that they were welcomed, let's put it that way. So I had to make that intentional effort. And it was difficult also, again, doing this during COVID, where people couldn't even, see who I was as a person, of color, coming to them and saying, look, this is for you. I am here for you to be supportive. So that just made it like, harder, so to say.
Jason, I wonder if you want to add anything to that. I know Juan Barraza, who's a colleague of yours at PSU, and also a collaborator on the research that you worked on, has spoken to this a bit in your campus context.
Yeah, I mean, so PSU is the most diverse university in Oregon, and the School of Business is the most diverse school out of 10 schools and colleges at PSU. So we have a really amazing student body that is representative of the local community. But often we have folks who come in and they come from an entrepreneurial family or an entrepreneurial community, but they often lack access to the resources they need to really be successful. And they face a lot of barriers, and often those barriers are related to their identity. People are dealing with racism, they're dealing with homophobia, they're dealing with transphobia. And again, you can look at the research and you can look at who's getting funded and who's not, and there are a lot of issues there. And so a huge part of dealing with that at PSU that Juan and I have done is to make certain that we have representation and diversity in our judges, in our instructors, in our speakers. And maybe I'll skip ahead actually and answer the question that Mike asked, because it's related, which is, how does this experience transform how I taught and what was the outcome? So as a result of this, I was running a certificate program in social entrepreneurship at the time and teaching in the program. And I brought in consultants, went to workshops, did trainings. And I ended up going through every single piece of content in all the courses that I taught or co-taught in. So videos, readings, assignments, guest speakers. And I looked at sort of who's the author, who's the speaker, what are we talking about? So, building in more discussions around equity, but also making certain that the people the students saw and read were more representative and more diverse. And what I found was that instead of just grabbing something off the shelf that I had read in grad school, or pulling one of, somebody from my circle of friends to come speak because I knew them, actually going out and thinking about this, I ended up with better content. I ended up with better guest speakers. We really changed how we recruited instructors for the program, and we ended up with better instructors. And I saw a huge difference in the students. we begin asking halfway through each course questions like, do you feel represented? Do you see an aspect of your identity represented in the course? Do you feel welcome? What content would you add? How would you change the course in these anonymous surveys? And I would collect all this feedback. And the next week I'd go back to the students and I would say, this is what I'm going to change based on your feedback. I'm going to change some of this for this course. Some I'm going to have to take longer to implement, but I will let you know. And what I saw is that my students began to do better. They began to do better emotionally, and they began to do better academically. And I had students come say to me and talk to me about this, how important it was to see their identities and their experiences reflected in all these different elements of the program and their courses, and all of the extracurricular programming that wanted, whether it's judges for competitions or it's mentors for students. He's done an incredible job really diversifying that group of people. And so what we ended up with was students who were emotionally thriving more, students who were performing better academically. And you know what? I felt honestly that I could bring more of my authentic self to the classroom. I started practicing a little more vulnerability, sharing a little bit more about my own personal story, growing up in poverty. And I was happier and I was more effective and I was connecting with my students better. And students were talking about more about their identities and how their experiences shaped what they wanted to do and what their ideas were, when they felt comfortable doing so, and really connecting their entrepreneurial concepts to who they were and what their communities needed. And it had an incredible impact. And so that's the positive. And the downside is I realized that I had really been letting my students down by not building out more representation, by not including more diversity, by not talking about these concepts, because it was striking to see how much better they did when I was able to do that more effectively.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And I think you got into one of the additional questions that came in the chat around particularly strategies or ways of framing innovation and entrepreneurship that are engaging to students. And I wonder, Zoe or Monica, if you want to add anything to that from your experiences.
Yeah, I kind of want to couple this question with something that I believe Tyrone said earlier about language, right? It's a lot of people have been innovating for a long time. A lot of people have been entrepreneurs for a long time. They just hadn't realized it because they called it something different, right? They call it hustle, they call it the grind, and so I think one thing that's super important, especially when we do our outreach, is like really trying to meet students where they are and help them and use language that helps them to identify that you actually are an entrepreneur, right? Before I even started my role at NACCE City, I was a creativepreneur is what I called it. And I never considered myself an entrepreneur because I wasn't rooted in, just this need to like make more money. It was more of like passion project type work, but that is still entrepreneurship, right? So making sure that we're creating and using language that students identify with. Also, similar to Monica's work, we also, and I actually think inspired by Monica's work, we also created pathways. So we have 5 key pathways that help our students identify. They may not be entrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurship is just one of the pathways, but entrepreneurship and creative and civic innovation, like those are all pathways towards innovation, and even Explorer that we help our students kind of opt into, right? And they can also opt into more than one as they identify, but it allows us to be more creative, strategic, and thoughtful in our approach for how we're able to engage them once they come through our doors.
Great. So what I learned when I was at Smith College, in order to attract students to our programming, again, students go to Smith College not to learn about entrepreneurship. This is a liberal arts institution, no business courses. There were 2 entrepreneurship courses which I taught, but it wasn't even for a grade. So we would use language. We removed the word entrepreneurship in the language that was used to market our programming. So we would, try to attract students by saying, learn how to identify problems and create innovative solutions. Like students felt okay with the word innovation. They did not feel okay with the word entrepreneurship. So in learning from that, I brought those learnings I brought to USC, where we created a small cohort program launched last year called Trojan Solvers, which was run by a serial entrepreneur teaching students how to solve a problem using lean startups. So they were all in a cohort together. He was teaching them as he was developing his new business. But again, in order to attract students to Trojan Solvers, we never use the word entrepreneurship. We ask them, what keeps you up at night? What problem would you like to solve? And we were able to have a cohort of students who would never have traditionally interacted with us or participate in our programming.
Great. And I see a couple additional comments in the chat around language, and that Katie was commenting that most entrepreneurs are not business majors, right? So the sort of casting that wide net. And I think definitely the students that participated for the study that informed our report, that language piece came across really strongly in terms of not even just a preference for words like innovator or change maker, but an actual a negative association often with entrepreneurship as connected to avarice or money as the sole focus. And so I think that's something that's really it seems is permeating in a lot of these examples. So there was one other question that I think all of you have touched on a little bit, and I wonder if we want to just close with that, and certainly if anyone has any other final questions in the chat, we can get to that, which is a little bit about misconceptions. So I think we've talked around that topic in a number of these examples, but what do you all think some of the biggest misconceptions are about potential innovators and entrepreneurs, particularly from groups that are underrepresented within science and tech innovation and entrepreneurship? And then I think you've started to also talk about what's holding back campus centers and sort of the people that would be able to potentially engage them. It's a big question.
Yes.
pick whichever strand you'd like.
Wait, so there were two parts. There was the part about engagement, and what was the first part again?
Misconception. So I think we kind of talked a little bit about, perhaps assumptions related to what language might be resonant, assumptions related to life experiences and what may, enable access pathways. So there's a lot there. So yeah, whatever you're gravitating towards that we haven't covered yet is great.
I can share a story that one of my students shared with me that I found really touching. And she was a much older student. I think she was in her 40s or 50s. We have a really broad age range of students at PSU. And I had shared some stories of entrepreneurs who had started their social enterprises or nonprofits much later in life. And she said, I didn't know you could become an entrepreneur at my age. I had never seen an entrepreneur who had started their business at my age. All I'd seen was these young white guys on TV, right? And so I think that's a huge misconception, is that there's a certain type of entrepreneur. And I think when you do a better job of representation and diversity in your mentors and your speakers and your examples, and people see these examples, they become inspired. I mean, she was like, oh, it doesn't matter that I'm this age. I could be an entrepreneur and be successful. I didn't miss my chance. And I realized that because I see somebody like me in this content.
I think one of the things that I don't think we've touched on is mindset, right? And it's important that students understand that developing this mindset doesn't necessarily need to be used to develop like a tech venture, right? It's important to understand what these tools and skills are, and it could be used in any context in whatever they decide to do post graduation. So that's one of the things I think is important to us. And we've developed programming here at USC and again at Smith. Overwhelmingly, I would say 99% of the students who participated in our program did not graduate and try and start any kind of a venture. They were going into the business world. Yet we were still engaging up until prior to COVID, a third of the campus in our activities, because we changed the way that we were presenting ourselves and the way that we talked about entrepreneurship with respect to mindset.
Yeah, and I think we at VentureWell recently did a retrospective of our ETIES program, which is our early stage innovator program. And one of the findings that has always stood out to me was, regardless of the ultimate pathway that those participants took, whether it was bringing the venture that they had brought to our program all the way to scale, whether they had ended up in a different venture setting or had pursued a completely different path, one of the things that was pretty consistent was their level of job satisfaction in whatever they picked. And so to me, that's one of those, it takes a while to start to see how those mindset skills really can shape wherever people land. But I think that's, as we look at the multiple pathways, it's really lays bare how that grounding, regardless of where in your career you start to have access to it, can shape outcomes. So we have just a couple minutes left, and I saw some more comments around, so it looks like there's a few things in here, but I'll just raise Katie's question in case there's a couple last thoughts anyone has. So going back to the sort of the trope of the young white guy as an entrepreneur, she says, how do you promote your activities to dispel that myth? So we definitely talked about language, and I'm curious if there's anything else that that you want to mention.
I'd love to take this question. Great question, Katie. One of the things, which is another piece of our DE&I work, is when we host workshops, when we have our accelerator program where we bring in speakers and presenters, we are prioritizing and making it a point to bring in a diverse set of speakers and presenters. We are not just bringing in the middle-aged white guy. We're not just bringing in, the young tech startup person. We're bringing in Black and brown people. We're bringing in women. We're bringing in people who started businesses in their 50s and in later ages. We're bringing in people who started businesses and exited businesses, right? We're making sure that we're bringing all of these different perspectives into the room to support and teach our students, because there's not just one journey towards entrepreneurship, and there's just not one entrepreneurial style or type. And so part of our work in dispelling that myth is making sure that we're bringing people in front of them, whether they're mentors, whether they're judges for our pitch competitions, application reviewers, whatever it may be, that we're bringing in people that offer that diverse perspective.
Fantastic. We have 2 minutes left. Does any other last words from our presenters? Okay. Perfect. So wanted to first say a big thank you to NACCE for the opportunity to host this conversation, and a big thank you to all three of our presenters, and to all of you in the audience for the great dialogue. This session has been recorded. So yep, if you want to wrap up, Erica, then perfect. All right. So it looks like tomorrow at noon is the last, the closeout event for National Entrepreneurship Week. And I also just wanted to mention before we wrap up, there's going to be an email that'll come out with some additional resources for links to the recordings of all of the other VentureWell conversations that we've had to date, both digging into action areas, as well as longer conversations about each of these resources. And also wanted to mention that our conference Open, which is our VentureWell's annual conference, which will be a digital event, will be happening in March, and encourage folks to look into that as well, and hope to see you there. We will definitely have more conversations related to equity and inclusion, as well as many other topics within this space. And with that, I think we can close out, and thanks again for coming, and hope that everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to join today.
Yeah.